Good. Well, thank you for those who have managed to submit their assignment, and quite a few of you have. There's still a few to come, and please, when you get a chance, try to get to that one and upload it. But if anybody wanted to possibly volunteer to just talk us through their site and some of the factors that they thought influenced exposure, likelihood, and severity, and then some ideas on things that could alter exposure, likelihood, and severity. What I'll do is just street view dive into your site. So all you need to do is put your hand up, and we'll find you and unmute you, and we'll talk through it. So if anybody wants to do that, it would be great to have a volunteer. But if not, I'll just talk through one that I found. Not seeing anybody popping their hand up. It's probably a pretty easy way to win a prize, isn't it, Kathy?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Pop your head up? No? Okay. Well, if anybody after I have a chat through this other one wants to do that, please do so. Now, okay, I've got a site, which was somebody's site, and I just used it as it's a bit of a random example, but what do? I go to screen 2. All right, so we are in Queensland, yes. What's that, Hatton Vale? So somebody knows the site well, no doubt. So when I look at a site like this, we've got an intersection coming up, obviously. And so what influences exposure at this site? Well, the exposure is really, in a safe system assessment sense, for passenger vehicle crashes, it's the number of vehicles on this road, on the highway. I'll zoom up a bit and we'll get up here. It's the number of vehicles on the side road. See, those vehicles and these vehicles, they're exposed to crashes. I suppose one of the things that would influence those numbers is your land use. You know, you got your shopping centre there, and it's that's sort of creating the exposure or influencing how much exposure there is. And I haven't got to marking them all yet, but I'm going to be pretty sort of relaxed on people who have put that in as a exposure factor, because that first assignment is really about just sort of thinking about exposure being the numbers of vehicles, the number of pedestrians, the number of cyclists. And that's influenced by those sort of things, you know, generators of people, generators of trips. So in an actual safe system assessment, you don't actually really take that into account. I mean, you look at that sort of stuff, but your exposure analysis is just based on the numbers, the number of vehicles going through here, the number of vehicles here, the number of pedestrians that are crossing, the number of cyclists that are using the road. So it's just a numbers thing in exposure. The likelihood of a crash in this, well, if we take the intersection itself, let's go with the intersection as a crash type. So we'll come back to run-off road crashes or head-on crashes. But for passenger vehicles, what's influencing that? So what's influencing that? Well, first thing I'd say is you've got a left turn lane here, which is going to potentially block sight lines of vehicles that are trying to exit. You've got 2 lanes to cross uncontrolled, so there's an increased chance of a crash happening there. If we go up a bit further, is it? So I'm just going to turn around here. So we've got all movements available, so there's increased likelihood of crashes there. We've got a pretty nasty angle of a slip lane, pretty nasty stand-up angle, so that's not going to help in terms of crashes. That's pretty bad. That's going to cause some trouble, and that's simply because of the challenge is to look around, and it's not really. I thought for a second it could be a full acceleration lane, but it's not long enough to get that to happen. So you've got some things there. We've got lighting, so that'll reduce the likelihood of crashes at night. The line marking's fairly good, so that will reduce. The surface is fairly good. That will reduce the likelihood as well. The speed, I'm not sure what the speed limit here is, or the operating speed, but I assume it's 100 kilometers an hour, or maybe 80, anyway. That's a fairly high speed. So the reaction, the ability for people to react and avoid is lessened. So there's something that would increase the likelihood. So you can see these are all sort of the factors that I'm just starting to think through just on the intersection crashes themselves. Interestingly, the volume, the side road volume, influences both the exposure and the likelihood. So higher volume on your side road influences the likelihood of crashes. There's more vehicles coming out that are likely to be present. Then if we get to the severity on this intersection, the severity of any crashes that would occur. Now, the severity is really going to be based on a handful of things that could influence that. The speed of the vehicles, the bullet vehicles on the main, on the highway. The angle of crashes that can happen, so we can have vehicles coming out here, and that's a pretty much right angle crash. Vehicles turning in here is fairly close to a right angle crash as well. So that's the angle of crashes that we can have. And then I suppose the weight, the presence of a lot of heavy vehicles or the like would influence the severity of these crashes as well. It's more likely that it'll be a more severe crash if you've got a lot more heavy vehicles using the road. They're predominantly the things that are going to be major influences on the severity of these intersection crashes. When I look at run-off road crashes, let's swing around, shall we? So now we're talking about run-off road. The things that are going to influence the likelihood of run-off road. So the fact that it's a fairly straight alignment reduces the likelihood. Doesn't eliminate run-off road, absolutely not, but it reduces the likelihood. We know there's more run-off road crashes where there are curves as well. There's a small sealed shoulder there, so that's probably going to lessen the likelihood, and the line marking is fairly good. There's guideposts. So these are all things that are sort of maybe bringing the likelihood down a little bit. Some of the things that might increase the likelihood, again, the speed. Depending on where this area is, you could say, well, it's, there's a high likelihood of fatigue because it's between two major centers or something like that. And then another thing that influences the likelihood of crashes is whether or not there are fixed hazards. So we see there's not too many fixed hazards in the roadside, in immediate vicinity of the roadside. So there's probably less, that probably brings down the likelihood of run-off road crashes, because people could leave this and then recover and come back on the road and continue on. There is no crash. So whether or not there are objects in the in the roadside is a likelihood factor. What type of objects they are the severity factor. So if you had a whole lot of frangible light poles, or maybe shrubs or the like, or small bits of vegetation, you might say the likelihood is high because they're going to hit stuff, but the severity is low. So the severity in this case, to me, I'd have down a little bit, because if they leave the road, maybe more likely to roll over than hit something in these areas. We've got some signposts and things that are going to be frangible for passenger vehicles. We do have the utility pole there, which is going to be more severe. So that might factor in a little bit into my thinking. And you could also think about the other side of the road where there's another utility pole. A lot of people, I think, want to try to talk about objects in the roadside as an exposure factor. So the exposure to runoff road crashes for passenger vehicles is simply the number of vehicles using the highway. That's it. Now you might say, well, if there's nothing in the roadside, they're not exposed to runoff road crashes. Well, they are, because of rollover, crash potential, and continuing on beyond any cleared areas and striking things quite far back. There's also temptation for people to revert to clear zone thinking and say, well, there's nothing in the clear zone, so there's no exposure to runoff road crashes. Well, no, that's not right. We certainly know vehicles will go well beyond the clear zone, and as I mentioned, there's that rollover possibility. Taking into account, things like we've got, what do we got? A culvert here. There you go, culvert head wall, I'd call that. Other people might call it something else, a wing wall or something like that. Doesn't have drivable culvert end wall, so that to me would increase the severity of crashes. Its presence there increases the likelihood of a runoff road crash. So people who leave the road there are going to hit that and be involved in a crash. So there's just a couple of crash types examples and how I sort of go through that thinking, and that's what you've got to do in a safe system assessment. I won't go through all the crash types. I just wanted to give a little bit of an indication. But things you could then start to do to influence the exposure, the likelihood, or the severity. The exposure, we'll go back to intersection crashes, becomes pretty hard to influence. Really, the options you have to influence the exposure, because it's the number of vehicles passing through this intersection, is to try to reduce the number of vehicles passing through this intersection in one way or another. So it could be that you block off this access point altogether. That would significantly reduce the exposure to intersection crashes, because there essentially wouldn't be an intersection there. Now, for the purposes of your assignment, that would be fine, because there was no need to consider actual practical reality or anything like that. It was just, what could actually do that. Big flyovers would also do it, because you're not then exposed to that direct intersection crash. You might have some side swipe style merging crashes, but that would basically eliminate the exposure to crashes. A roundabout or something like that would not alter the exposure, unless you had some traffic modeling or something that showed by introducing that people are going to use other areas, or it's going to significantly change the travel patterns and the number of vehicles, or it's going to significantly increase it, for example. But a roundabout would influence the severity of crashes. And that's because we know that any crashes that occur will be lower speed and better angles. We don't tend to reduce the likelihood of crashes with a roundabout, even though the conflict points are less. We do know that there's an increase in rear end crashes, and on a two-lane road like this, we're probably going to get side swipe style crashes occurring within the roundabout. So predominantly a severity reduction. A set of traffic signals here would reduce the likelihood of crashes, because it would tell vehicles, when their go is. But without something to reduce the speed significantly, the severity would stay the same, the exposure would stay the same. The exposure would not be influenced by the fact that we're telling people to stop, because we have to account for the ability to have red light running crashes, which will happen. So that was just a random example. It was one that somebody had used, and they did a pretty good job. And I've gone at a, Kathy, you'll like this, broad brush level. There's a lot more intricate detail you can use, such as looking at, okay, well, this one is a slip-based pole. You can look at your delineation, the clarity of your signage, the stand-up angle of the slip lanes, you know, where this extra give way is located. So you've got a give way sort of there, hold line there, and a secondary one there. Certainly, if people are holding back there, their dynamic visual obstruction, their masking from the left turners will be huge. They won't be able to see if that's happening. But they're propping out there; they're a bit closer to the lane, and you know the list goes on. So when you're documenting a safe system assessment and you're doing this analysis, it can be quite a lot of factors that are influencing how you're arriving at your decision on scores. This is how we actually get to scores. So, I mean, this is a fairly stock standard intersection out there, but without knowing anything about the intersection or anything about the crashes, I know that the potential energy here is high, and so when incidents happen, they're likely to be quite severe just due to the speeds that people are going through the conflict points. There's some characteristics in there that might make it a little bit more likely to crash. And so we're getting a mix there, which is quite, starting to get, I suppose, not very well aligned with safe system principles. I've just noticed then there are some floral arrangements on the giveaway. So obviously an incident has occurred there in the past, and no doubt the energy came into play there, which is exactly what we're trying to prevent. So feel free to pop your hand up if you've got any questions or comments on that one, or you did want to go through your one. I'm happy to do that, or pop it into the chat, and Kathy will feed me back some information.
And just on this one, comments come through. I'm not sure if you know. It looks like a new construction. When was it constructed?
I don't know. I don't know this site. As I say, it was somebody's from the group's site that they chose, so I don't really know any of the background about it. I just grabbed it as one to use as an example. Does look somewhat new. The
That's okay. Andrew's chipped in with it's not new. Is it 100 k's an hour? Do we know the speed along that stretch there?
I don't. Let's go down after.
No, it is. Again, we've got support from the group here. Yep.
Yeah. So I was going to say, after an intersection like that, we should get a speed reassurance sign, but I suppose because it's default 100 kilometers per hour, not required. Some other things, I suppose, that'll factor in, obviously, your advanced warning. Are we warning if this intersection looks like there's a crossroad warning sign? So there you go. You've got a warning sign there. You've got a dedicated turn facility. So there's some things that bring the likelihood down, but the energy potential there is quite high. Back to runoff road, lots of hazards in the roadside here. No audio tactile, edge line's going to bring it up a bit. Obviously no barrier system, so the severity is going to be high. If there was a barrier system continuous through the roadside, for example, that would reduce the severity of runoff road crashes. It would not reduce the likelihood. In fact, you could argue it would increase the likelihood of runoff road crashes because it's closer to the running lane, so more likely to hit the barrier, and as soon as you hit the barrier, you're involved in a crash. So that's a severity reduction technique, extremely effective severity reduction technique. So it can be a little bit challenging for people to get their head around this. Now, so the purpose of us doing that first exercise is for you to start to think about these things in this categorization of exposure, likelihood, and severity. We did it last module. We're going to do it this module. And your safe system assessment, that's what you have to do. You have to break down the risk into its characteristics of exposure, likelihood, and severity. And certainly when your assignments are marked, when your safe system assessment is marked, if you're putting factors in the wrong category, you lose marks immediately on that. Now, some of it's fairly clear, like signs, line marking, lighting, they're all going to be likelihood influences. All your delineation, it's all likelihood. Traffic signals, likelihood. Severity, speed, angle, presence of heavy vehicles, the severity of the roadside hazards. These are the major influences. Exposures, numbers. Number of pedestrians, number of cyclists, number of motorcyclists, number of vehicles. Now then you do get into some very intricate sort of decision making around, is it influencing exposure, likelihood, severity? And there are quite a number of specifics that you may or may not encounter that we felt we needed to provide a bit more guidance on. It's not clearly defined in the Austroad Safe System Assessment Framework or the Victorian or South Australian guidelines. So we've created a few interim fact sheets as they go about thinking about doing updates to this. And what we've done is we've put those into your memory stick, but also on Moodle, so you can have a look at these. And so we have 6 specific topics. So one's talking about exposure at an intersection. So here's a little diagram. You've got 9,000 vehicles per day on the main, and you've got 1,000 vehicles a day on the side. Well, is the exposure to crashes 9,000 or 1,000 or 10,000? And the decision was made to try and get consistency across industry that it would actually be 10,000. So you have to have the addition of both of those. So that's one. This is much more into the details of a safe system assessment. So I'll come back to that, but it's how to do a safe system assessment of a route project, not just an isolated intersection or the like. Again, scoring we haven't got to, but we put some scores to things. That likelihood score we put is a relative likelihood score compared to other areas. This is a really good one. When you've got bike facilities, how do you score those? Are they exposure? Are they likelihood? Are they severity? Well, that's depends. Very much depends. Standard on-road bike lanes. That's going to influence the likelihood. So if you've got them, bit of a reduction in the likelihood of crashes. Separated on-road bike lanes, still a likelihood. Off-road path, close to road, likelihood still. So even though it's off the road, it's still a likelihood factor. Off-road path, close to road, plus on-road lanes, still in likelihood. Okay, off-road path, distant from the road, so really quite far away, then we're happy to move that to an exposure. Those cyclists are no longer exposed to crashes as people leave their lane. And reduced speed limit is likelihood and severity, because the chance of a crash is less. And if it does happen, the severity is less as well. Another one that we probably could have added in here was where you provide physical separation with a barrier system or the like, and that is going to influence exposure. There's some ones on intersection scoring and whether or not to pick likelihood or exposure, but I'll let you read those in your own time. Kathy, I'll pause there, see if there's any questions.
No, we're all good at the moment. Thanks.
Okay. So this module, we are going to talk about vulnerable road users. So I sort of skipped past a few discussions on vulnerable road users in the first two modules to really, hone in on that passenger vehicle and get the principles of that right, because the principles still apply in terms of exposure, likelihood, and severity for vulnerable road users. It's just that there's a few different characteristics when you come into looking at it. So I'm going to again do some slides, but I'll get you involved shortly, sorry, bear with me. I'm going to actually try to do that on my screen so I can. Oh, good. Okay, thanks, Kathy. That's good. Let me get my little pen. Oh. Okay. So let's hope this all works. All right. Yeah, so exposure, likelihood, and severity, they're the three really critical things to a safe system assessment. And you'll probably be so sick of me saying those three words by the end of this course, but I'm okay with that as long as you actually put it into play in your safe system assessments as you do them. Exposure, as I talked about, are the numbers, the number of vehicles exposed to that crash. And so you see that full separation there that we've got with the bike path means that exposure to crashes with passenger vehicles has been eliminated essentially by the addition of or the construction of that separated facility. So in the Australian Safe System Assessment Framework, we see it's the definition really of exposure. This refers to which road users in what numbers and for how long they are using the road and thus exposed to a potential crash. The measure of exposures include AADT, side road traffic volume, number of motorcyclists, cyclists and pedestrians crossing or walking along the road. So it's really the key here thing is to just remember you've got to be able to address that to a number. As I said, those fact sheets should be helpful for you in a number of the situations that you find yourself in. So this module, we're going to talk about movement in place or some sort of planning framework, whatever you use, and how that sort of directly relates to safe system thinking. Characteristics for vulnerable road users and how they align or don't align so well with safe system principles, and key risk factors for vulnerable road users in terms of the exposure, the likelihood and severity. Don't forget to count your wallies. So let's have a chat about movement in place. So movement in place really is a sort of planning framework and how you think about characterizing parts of the road network into their function. And it's quite quite the way to go these days. I suppose one of the important things to acknowledge as you break down what movement in place means really is to say, well, roads these days are more than just movement corridors. I suppose they were originally, built to move stuff, but communities have started to build up around them and congregate around them and trade and socialize, and they've become, in some instances, places, a place for all that interaction, all that vibrancy, all that community value. And a movement in place categorization squarely sort of acknowledges that and says that this is something that we need to take into account as we go about planning and managing our road network. So a simple movement and place diagram to try to capture some of that thinking. Now, there's a lot more to movement and place than just this diagram or variations in this diagram. Is to say that each part of the road network, a road, a street, a highway, a motorway, whatever it is, can be categorized into this graph in terms of its movement function or its place function. So on the y-axis, we've got movement, x-axis, we've got place. And so movement is the movement of people and goods. So don't get drawn into thinking it's simply how many cars you can get through there. It's however you move people and goods. So it could be public transport, could be cyclists, could be whatever, but they've got to be moving through that area. You know, so you've got to be trying to make that throughput. A lot of the time it does come back to cars. They're our dominant transport mode for most of that, you know, travel beyond a very short distance. So it does come back to that a lot, but don't be solely dictated by trying to push vehicles through there. You need to understand your road use hierarchy, your aspirations, your modal aspirations, and those sorts of things. The place are some of those things that I mentioned before. What is the high place value is really, there's a lot of interaction, social interaction, trading, vibrancy, really mingling and all of that sort of happening. And so what you do is you look at your road and you can give it a sort of existing movement of place categorization or an aspirational movement of place categorization. This is where we're trying to get it to. But what we then see is that, you know, roads with solely a movement function could be something like a motorway, or it could be an absolute dedicated cycleway, for example. That would be a high movement corridor. You're not expecting lots of trade and activity and socializing and the like on a dedicated cycleway. So, you know, in a similar sense, it's a movement corridor. Down the other extreme, if we've got something that's very much just a place, something down here, this is where we're talking about a mall or an area really where there, you know, it's full of activity and trading and people interacting and socializing and those sorts of things. These are sort of how you, I suppose, place a community value on these things. So if we go to something down here, which we don't have a huge place value or a huge movement value on, these tend to be things like residential streets, which can be a bit disturbing to the residents if you tell them there is really not much place value in the street that they live in. But you remember, that's the place value in that interaction, that trade, that socialization, all those sorts of things. And then up here where we have both high place value and high movement function, up here, often referred to as things like vibrant streets, but they're your high streets. This is where, you know, it does have play that major movement function, public transport, cars, getting people through there. But the activity is built up around that in such a way that it's very much also a place. It's got a lot of trading, a lot of interaction, a lot of things going on. Now, and then you've got your arterial network and, you know, major arterials and the like, which do have a little bit of place value often, things popping up here and there, but not much at all. So when you're doing a safe system assessment, this information about where it's categorized really doesn't play a major role in the actual scoring and assessment of the existing road or the design. Where it comes into play in a huge way is when you start to make recommendations in alterations to the design. Now, I'll just use some very, you know, extreme examples, almost, you know, ridiculous examples, but they highlight the point here. if you know something's been identified in these sort of areas here, it's clearly a major movement function, it's a motorway or it's a major arterial corridor, we technically could achieve high level of alignment with safe system principles by putting in place a 50-kilometer, 40-kilometer per hour speed zone and some traffic management features, local area traffic management features to bring the, to reinforce that and really bring those speeds down. But you're completely ignoring the function of that facility. Likewise, in some of these other roads, maybe not quite down to the mall one, but if we're up here, we've got the high street, for example. We could achieve high alignment with safe system principles by putting full containment barriers, high barriers down either side of the road, and building up some fencing on top of the barriers to ensure pedestrians can't actually get through, and really, segregating it off so pedestrians are not exposed to the vehicle crashes. But you've immediately just destroyed the place value of that area. Yes, you've achieved your safe system outcomes in that sense, but it's not part of the functioning of that road system or any aspirations we have. So you need to really be able to acknowledge where it fits in this and make decisions accordingly. A lot of you have probably intuitively been doing this for your whole career. The movement of place is just a terminology way of thinking about things, probably a bit more acknowledgement of place value and those sorts of things. But it shouldn't be too, it's fairly logical stuff really when it's laid out like that, and it's probably the way you think about things anyway. So what I'm going to do is just jump through a few of these categorizations and talk about how you might get your safe system, high alignment with safe system principles, while acknowledging that desire or that function, that movement and place function of that area. So you see, these places for people are really, you have the ability to, blanket speeds down, heavily restrict vehicle access, and the like. You can, plant them out. So let's do a little exercise, actually. What we're going to do here is we've got this very, artistic impression, hypothetical example here. The current conditions are a 40-kilometer per hour speed limit, which is quite nice that it's in there. But this has been clearly defined as a, where can I write this? So it's place. So when we look back here, we're in these places for people category. It's really got high place value and fairly low movement function when it's categorized. So what I want you to do is just in the chat, type in there some things that you might alter in this road environment to get higher alignment with safe system principles, acknowledging that we've identified this as a major place for people. It's got high place value and fairly low movement value, and that's what we're aspiring to do. When you do that, I want you to, so if you, whatever you decide to say, maybe you want to add more lighting, okay? So you say, I would want you to, in the chat type, add more lighting, and then put in brackets L, or likelihood, because that influences the likelihood of crashes, okay? Now, I don't think any of you will be saying to add more lighting, but I use that one because it's just a random example. But when you write what you want to change, add in there if it influences exposure, likelihood, or severity. So do that in the chat, and I'm going to give you, 3 or 4 minutes to do that. take your time, and I'll just monitor the chat a bit on this other screen. Good, we're seeing some come in already, which is excellent. I'll give you a little bit of time to do that. And Kathy, let me know if any other questions have come up.
Oh, we had a hand up, but then the hand went down. If you wanted to raise your hand to ask a question verbally, please do so. Or if it was just accidental, I'll be quiet.
Okay, we're getting lots of good answers coming in here. Thank you. Wow. It's a good group, Kathy. You can really get into it. I like it. All right, I'm going to start going through. There's a huge amount there, so I won't get through everybody's. But okay, we've got reduce the width of the road, and that's certainly going to make it more add to the place value. So it very much aligns with that sort of thinking. And it's going to reduce the likelihood of crashes because the pedestrians have a shorter length to cross, they'll be easier seen. It's also likely to result in some reductions in vehicle speeds as well. The narrower it is, the slower people tend to go. So you get a reduction in likelihood there and potentially a little bit of a reduction in severity, but I think likelihood is the way to go on that. So reduce speed further, absolutely. So you can do that either through speed limits or through complementary sort of local area traffic management or traffic calming features. And that will reduce the likelihood and severity of crashes. So you've got more time to react and the severity will be less. So we had a few people in there pushing for pedestrian crossings. Now that's an interesting one. It certainly will align better with safe system principles. If they're just at grade, they might reduce the likelihood of crashes. If they're raised crossings and they influence speed as well, we get likelihood and severity reduction in crashes. Do they align with place? Well, it depends, I suppose, as you need to be a little more granular there on how you define place. But quite often these really hugely heavily place valued areas, people don't like to try to corral pedestrians to only one place to cross. Keep that permeability and free ability to cross, but blanketing speeds or the number of vehicles down significantly is where you kind of want to go. But absolutely valid point, and you'd need a lot more sort of refinement to know whether that would be quite appropriate or not, but fairly a good thing to bring up. Same with cycle paths as well. I mean, it's, again, depends how much your movement function is in there. If it's really a place, it's almost more like a mall, shopping area, trading area in this highest end place value, but certainly those things will align better with safe system principles if you can do some of that. Make it a one-way system. Now, this is an interesting one in terms of exposure or likelihood or severity. There's probably an argument for each. Without any traffic modeling data or the like, you might want to you might assume then that you're making another route the other way in order for people to get there. So you're actually probably going to keep similar volume. So maybe exposure might still be the same. Likelihood might be less. It's easier for pedestrians and cyclists and those to know where vehicles are coming from. And severity, it depends really on speed. Maybe some of the angles on vehicle-to-vehicle crashes would be better, but that's a bit of a debatable one. So I tend to put a change to one-way system without more information and data and the like into a likelihood factor. So reducing parking or removing the parking, another good one in terms of opening up sight lines, ability to see, people not darting out from behind, parked cars like this, little pedestrian there that might be ducking out. So certainly reducing likelihood from that sense, but you have to be cautious not to be opening it up and widening the road then, which would increase speed, and then you didn't get an increase in the likelihood and severity. So you might overshadow your reductions in likelihood by opening sight lines by increased speed and severity. So we've got lots of support for lowering speed, and that's absolutely great. And you can jump ahead there. I was going to keep going with a few other things. Let's see if there's any that pop out. Okay, there's a couple of points around potentially adding pedestrian fencing to stop the pedestrians being able to get on, interact with the cars and have that conflict. Now, this is probably one where, in theory, it does increase alignment with safe system principles because you've lessened the likelihood of that crash happening. However, it is really quite against the place value and that categorization of place. That starts to really degrade your place value of the area by that corralling and fencing off of people. In these high place values, you want that permeability, you want that ability for easy, free sort of flow. So let's sort of look at, again, artistic impression. You don't want to take too much out of this because it's artistic impression, but you can see a lot of those features that you're talking about. Very low speed environment, could even be shared zone style. This one does have a crossing point, but it's got easy ability to still cross at any point at very low speeds. It's changed to a one-way system, as some of you had pointed out, widening the footpaths. And we've just got that you can just see immediately the place value of it has just gone up significantly. But also the safe system alignment has gone up with the lower speeds, the less conflict points, much clearer, easier to understand. And if people were to make mistakes in this area, you'd be fairly confident that it wouldn't result in death or serious injury. It was highly unlikely to result in death or serious injury. Getting speeds down under that sort of 20 kilometre per hour ideally, because there's no movement. There's no movement requirements through here. We established that. It's tiny, the movement requirements. So why try to maintain that speed through there of any degree, even though it was only 40, it's still, quite high there in terms of what its actual movement and place function was. So happy to take questions or comments on that, or people who disagree or the like. But we got a huge amount of great stuff put in there. There's another one in there that's that was sort of talking about, well, some of the wider elements of the safe system. Can we educate the kids not to run out on the road? Can we ensure that everybody's wearing helmets, riding their bike, and these sorts of things? That's certainly part of our safe system, looking at all those elements. The I suppose fundamental premise of how we go about designing and operating these things, though, is to ensure that even if one of the kids does make a mistake, which they will, and run after a bowl or something like that, and their education has flown out of their mind, or they're playing a game or wrestling each other or whatever it is, that kids do and humans do, that the outcome is not that death and serious injury. But it certainly does play a role to try to get people to understand how to utilize these facilities and use the appropriate equipment. Okay. Oh, missed a slide here. Okay, I'm just going to get out of this for a second. Sorry, bear with me. Kathy, any questions come in?
Not at the minute, Ken.
Okay, just sorry. Don't know what's happened here. I'm just going to quickly fix my slides, if that's all right. Now, Kathy, do you want to just mention anything about the assignments while I'm doing this?
Thanks, Ken. Actually, just a question that's popped up. What is the highest speed you would use for a shared zone?
So the highest speed I would use for a shared zone is 20 kilometers per hour. However, you need to check your local. I'm not 100% sure whether Queensland accepts a 20 kilometre per hour shared zone. Victoria certainly does. Most jurisdictions seem to only accept a 10 kilometre per hour shared zone. But certainly we've done quite a few 20s, and they seem to work pretty well.
Okay.
All right, we're back now. Apologies about that, because we're just going to do a similar exercise with a. Can you see my Zoom bar, Kathy?
No.
Oh, that's good then. Okay. So let's have a look. So we did places for people, and we went through that. And so what happens here within your movement and place categorization is you've got these granular differences between these really, really high place areas, but you've got some where they start to get a more of a movement function in there. And you need to then start to slightly adapt your design or the like. And you can see this one's got a bit more of that, I suppose, movement function built into it, still acknowledging the very high place value of it. So down to 30 kilometers, trying to get speeds, vehicle speeds at absolute maximum around that, probably dampening the speeds down a little bit at some conflict points, but still widening and providing those through facilities. So as your movement function increases, you can start to, feed in some of these facilities. Local streets. How are we getting on time? Okay. Local streets. So as I said, fairly low place value, fairly low movement function. And this gives us the ability then to start to restrict fast movement through there. And this comes back to a bit of, transport planning 101, maybe, plan for the most vulnerable road users and those using the most amount of their own personal energy is a pretty good way to think about your planning. So they should have priority where possible. So yes, certainly these do have a movement function in terms of access to houses and the like, but you can certainly bring the speed significantly down. If they're being used as a movement corridor, it's usually rat running and something that we don't want to encourage due to the fact that we do have the presence of vulnerable road users around. So I'll go through this. I won't do the same exercise. We'll do the same exercise on the next one. You see, this one's a little bit more, I suppose, open. If we categorize this one as more in that local streets style environment, so lowish place value, lowish movement, you still have the ability to try to bring it back to something a bit more like this. You've got a bit more movement function through there, but certainly the facilities, the speeds are very low. The facilities for pedestrians and cyclists are much greater, and it's a much more. It's really enhanced the place value of it, and kept the movement function low, or even lowered it to try to make it more comparative to the place function. And it's an acknowledgement of trying to protect your most vulnerable, and that you want these spaces to have a bit more of that place function. We'll do the vibrant streets together, although there may be a question that's popped in there. I see something flashing on my screen. But these categorizations are a bit more difficult. And this is because we've got somewhere in the high place value and somewhere in the fairly high movement function. So let's have a look at this one. And it's, again, it's going to be a little bit difficult, but what we've got here is a 70 km/h speed limit, and we'll say operating speed as well. We do have a pedestrian overpass there existing, and you can see there that you've got pedestrians, cyclists, you've got public transport, passenger vehicles at speed, bit of sidewalks. And so because it's in the vibrant place category, we're also must know that there's trade, there's activity, there's interaction all along the sides here as well. So let's do the same little activity where you can just jot in some ideas, some thoughts on things that would make this better aligned with safe system principles, acknowledging that it has both that movement and place function, and put in there whether what you're suggesting influences exposure, likelihood, or severity. Well, it looks like Bart's just shared with everybody in Queensland, your manual for uniform traffic control devices, part 4, is a 10 km/h maximum for a shared zone. A shared zone being an area where pedestrians have priority over vehicles for the entire area. Thank you for that. Yeah, Victoria's a bit different in that, with the 20 km/h shared zone. And don't get shared zones and shared paths mixed up. They're different things, but I do see people quite often mixing the terminology up. Okay, seeing some good stuff come in. Make sure you put exposure, likelihood, or severity. This might be a good opportunity also to have a stretch, fill up your water. I'm actually going to give you a few minutes here now, a good few minutes to have that stretch, fill fill up your water, fill up your coffee. We'll be back in 3 minutes from when I finish talking. So 3 minutes from
We'll be back at 10:06, I think is what he meant to say.
Okay. Thanks, Kathy. Okay, let's get back into it. So we had again a wonderful sort of response here. Just going to go back right up to the top. So we had some desire there for higher barriers to limit pedestrian crossing. So that in one sense is great, but again, it still challenges that place value. So it limits the ability for that permeability and that interaction. Certainly does align highly with safe system principles because we're stopping that conflict ability. There is that overpass already there, so trying to push people through that. But generally, you might get some pushback from the planners in terms of that specific alignment with the place value. So just be slightly cautious on that, and you want to get a bit more detail and analyze that. Adding cycle lanes certainly is something that would align highly with safe system principles, or ideally separated cycle facilities within the large sort of road carriageway space you have, because you're then going to make it less conflict points with passenger vehicles. The cycle lanes tend to not have a major impact on the place value of the area as well, and can actually sort of provide increased place value in some situations. Lowering the speed, absolutely. Oh, sorry, back to the cycle lane. It's just, again, it depends on the specifics of it, and you need to refer to that fact sheet that we provided you as to whether that influences exposure, likelihood, and severity, or severity. Lowering the speed, absolutely. Because of that place value, your speeds are going to have to come down. If it was just purely a movement corridor, we could do those high barriers, make sure no pedestrians are crossing at grade, put them all over the grade separation, really restrict it from that sense. But because it's been acknowledged in the planning framework, in the movement in place, that this has big place value, it really is going to have to come down in speed, because you're going to get that interaction, that conflict, and it must be addressed from that severity perspective. If you were to decrease the pedestrians, it would decrease the exposure. So if you've got all the pedestrians to go over the grade separated facility, the overpass, then certainly it would reduce the exposure to crashes. I'm just saying that this is the whole point of this exercise, is to try to interlink that movement of place categorization with our safe system treatments. Lots of support there on speed reduction for likelihood and severity, which is wonderful. Raised crossing points, I really like this, and certainly some of you might be saying, oh, it looks like a big arterial, and I'm not sure that that's the right thing to be doing. But certainly looking at those conflict points and trying to reduce speed at those conflict points in particular has high alignment with safe system principles, helps out with the place categorization, still does acknowledge movement if they're designed in the right way. Yeah, so some people are putting in things like add traffic signals to influence the likelihood. And I think often in these areas where it is very challenging, those are pretty logical treatments. I do like to see them sort of raised in some way. They don't need to be raised like an urban speed hump, but it's something to continually calm down the traffic as it's going through these areas. Okay, here we go. So again, an artistic impression of it, how it could look, where you're still catering for the movement corridor through there, movement of cyclists as well as pedestrians, and as well as cars and public transport. So you can see you're catering for quite a bit of movement through there. It still maintains quite high place value because it's got the widened footpath areas. It's got points for them to cross which have been raised. But these two separated sort of through areas and defining the local access ones are at a much slower speed, whereas the absolute through ones still at quite a low speed, but just to get through the area, and it slows down significantly. So again, you can see the wonderful place value of this just from looking at it. Much better to be there having a drink or having dinner or catching up with friends or the like than this sort of environment. And it still should be able to get vehicles, people, and pedestrians and cyclists through the area quite well and accommodate that quite well. I've got a comment that's come in. Isn't there a conflict in saying it is a place versus not installing barriers to prevent pedestrians from crossing the lanes? So I think I'm getting caught up in double negatives here, but simply saying that barriers tend to like long barriers that stop pedestrians crossing and permeating the area tends to erode the place value of an area, is all I'm saying. It can do very good things in terms of reducing our trauma levels, but that's going to not fly in terms of a project that you're assessing and making recommendations on if they've identified it as a place a place for people, or it has high place value. What would the vehicle capacity per hour be for this road? Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but if you've got, and the point probably comes back to when you change it to this, you're certainly going to reduce the vehicle capacity through this area. But remember, I said earlier that movement is not just your vehicles per hour; it's your people moved through the area per hour. So you need to sort of factor all of that into play. But yeah, these are sort of, I'll say it again, broad brush examples, because they are trying to just give us a generic feel for this movement, place categorization, how you can achieve safe system outcomes through a variety of measures, high levels of alignment with safe system, but some may be better for different categorizations. Some of these sort of areas we're seeing, the different separated cycle facilities, protected intersections for cyclists are becoming these. These are the sort of features we're seeing in these areas that still are trying to maintain that highish movement function of cyclists, buses, cars, people walking as well. But also to give that place value. So there's another example there. Then when we move things into that movement corridor, what we need to do is really establish, and this probably links back to the comment that came in about vehicles per hour or the like. We've got to establish how we're trying to get that movement through this corridor. This is where you tend to do a road use hierarchy or the like, where you discover, is it a priority traffic route? Is it a priority bike route? Is it a priority public transport route? How are we going to get this movement? With what mode? And then you can make your decisions accordingly. But if a road like this, say, gets a priority traffic route, as its categorization, and it's a movement corridor with priority traffic route, and that basically means cars and trucks. This is where you are then in the realms of really trying to restrict access to vulnerable road users, restrict permeability, make it so they can't really access the road, and cyclists really can't be on the road. Banning cyclists from these routes, I'm completely okay with, as long as there's a parallel route for them to be used. And on those, we would legitimately look to ban cars or significantly reduce the volume of cars and the speed that they could get through there, because this is the priority traffic route. So this is where you're going to erode the place value of this. No doubt about it, to get higher alignment with safe system principles. But that's okay, because look, the place value is low. It's not our concern. So this is where I would be putting barriers down the side, pedestrian fencing to ensure pedestrians are not going in there, meaning that the vehicles can go through here at speed and not encounter vulnerable road users. We might need to think about how we treat the intersections to ensure vehicles are not going through at speeds above what we consider tolerable levels. But in general, that's sort of how we would think about this. And the intersections, as we say, you can do isolated speed management treatments, such as raised intersections or different features to slow vehicles down. So really, pedestrians and cyclists, they're our most vulnerable road users. We know the severity risks significantly increase over about 20 to 30 kilometres per hour, and very likely to be death around the 50 kilometres per hour. Obviously, young and old are even more vulnerable to physical force, and also vulnerable to more mistake making or just lack of cognitive ability and the like. And so we really want to try to manage speeds down where we have that pedestrian cyclist presence around the 20, 30 kilometre per hour mark, or look to start to make physical separation happen. And we know the separated bike facilities are showing to align quite well with safe system principles. A lot of devil in the detail of the design of these things, but in general. Roundabouts are certainly something that can be done very nicely for pedestrians and cyclists. There's an example of the Moray Street roundabout, which has cyclist and pedestrian facilities around it, operates beautifully and wonderfully aligned with safe system principles when you break it down and analyze it. Same theory can be done on higher speed multi-lane roundabouts potentially. Again, though, you've got sort of areas where you might need to have the cyclists and pedestrians give way. But that's been a big challenge, the two-lane roundabout, where a cyclist, traveling along to do a right turn would have to sort of cut across multiple lanes of traffic. So here's sort of just a sketch of the ability to have your bike path come off the road. You could have priority, bike path come off the road. You could have priority for cyclists on a leg if you wanted, and then you run them back through, avoiding a lot of the conflict within the circulating carriageway. It can be especially challenging when you have larger vehicles going through there and mixing with cyclists and the like. So separating out of that conflict point's really good. And if the cyclist wanted to turn right, the ideal would be for them to use this. Pause here, wait for their gap, cross, pause here, wait for their gap, cross, and continue on. Anyway, those are sort of the ideas that are being generated to try to make things a little friendlier for cyclists. Somebody's asked, what is a mammal? A mammal is a middle-aged man in lycra. Did I say mammal? I don't think maybe I did say mammal. I don't think I said mammal. Anyway, yeah, so a mammal is is a challenge, and I suppose that's an example that not all cyclists are the same, are they? And you've got to be thinking about all these different facilities. Would a mammal use the facility provided here? Debatable. I don't know. Maybe. Would a pack of mammals? I don't know what the collective noun for middle-aged men in lycra is, but let's say a peloton of mammals. Would they use it? Probably not. If they were out training, but certainly I categorise myself as a mammal. I would use that if I needed to do that turn and there was a bit of traffic around. It would provide that facility.
Ken, just a question.
Yeah.
Why are the left and right departures from the roundabout missing pedestrian/pelican crossings?
Left and right departures. So these areas, I assume we're talking about. Yeah, so I suppose this one was just a specific highway where it was quite a high volume traffic priority route, and you get some significant challenges around two-lane crossing points. So you're going to have the major traffic issues associated with that, and you have some challenges around two-lane crossing points. So I mean, hypothetically, if you put a zebra crossing across this for the pedestrians, you get a dynamic visual obstruction issue, which is quite challenging, where one vehicle sort of slams on the brakes because the pedestrian's coming out here. The other vehicle, and that vehicle is masking the other vehicle, and so we know there's an incident through there. So I mean, that's a likelihood influencer. Certainly, I have issues with any pedestrian priority crossings on two-lane roads like that. If they're raised, it's better because it reduces the severity of crashes. My preference, and I haven't seen anybody do it really well yet. We've got some concepts for it. If you have to do that, you almost make this a turbo roundabout. At least at the approaches, and so you sort of widen it out there, and you actually provide a raised separator in the middle, which would act as a refuge island. And so then the pedestrians would cross, you'd split your vehicles, and then it'd open up the sight lines. Somebody's saying these are common in the Netherlands. Yeah, so certainly the turbo roundabouts are common in the Netherlands, and I think, as Andrew's saying, they utilise that area then as a little sort of refuge, midway refuge. Should we think of a good name for it? Yeah, so that's the kind of thinking as to why it wasn't in there. But yeah, a lot of design work to be done. This is a very general thing here that we've got. Between 0 and 30, maybe 30 is pushing it. You can get cyclists to share lanes with drivers. So prize for the person who writes in the name of that symbol first. I think it would be used in Queensland as well. We'll find out if anybody pops it in there.
I don't think it is, Ken. Or is it a BAS? I don't think it's a BAS, is it? What does BAS stand for, Andrew?
It's not a BAS. It is used in the Off-Roads Guide, but so somebody might have come across it there. But anyway, that's all right.
Oh, bicycle awareness zone.
Oh, I like it. Prize for Andrew for that.
Okay.
Maybe that's what the Queenslanders call it. Anyway, Off-Roads Guide calls it a sharrow, a shared arrow, to indicate it's a part of the road where cyclists are sharing the road with vehicles. But I suppose bicycle awareness zone is the same general principle. So Andrew wins a prize. Easy as that to win a prize.
Good stuff.
Maybe we can send him some lycra. Once you're above 30 kilometres an hour, you need to start to physically look to separate, really, to get us a higher line, more safe system principles. On-road cycle lanes are okay at some at some lower speed end of this, but really physical separation is key. That could be curb separator, could be barrier systems. You can utilise parking and pushing it out to act as the separator, so the cyclist facilities on the other side of that. But then once you're up into this 70, we don't even want it near the road. You just got to physically get the cyclists out of their own dedicated facilities. And again, just a little rule, some rules of thumb there that you've got to think about in detail. Pedestrians. Well, I talked a little bit about pedestrian crossings. An at-grade pedestrian crossing, so, colloquial term being a zebra crossing, so it's a pedestrian crossing. When it's at grade, as in it's got no raised treatment with it, we know that actually is not a road safety treatment in most situations and can increase the risk of crashes. Because we know that vehicles aren't slowing down, sometimes they're not looking, pedestrians have priority and will walk out there. So we discourage that in a lot of situations. Yes, if you've got an area that's got blanketed speed reductions and local area traffic management and it's all operating very slow, it might be the appropriate treatment. But a lot of cases you want, well, pretty much in my mind, if you have the volumes to warrant, volumes and desire lines to warrant pedestrian priority, it should be raised. And people will say, oh, but it's a bus route or these sorts of things. Well, it must be raised, or it must have facilities to blanket speed significantly down on the approach to that conflict point, which is now enhanced because pedestrians have priority. So they're not going to be as aware. So if it's a bus, you got major concerns with buses, and mind you, buses don't actually have major problems with this. It's just a bit of a perception. But you could do a speed cushion on the approach. So speed cushion being, one that the buses straddle, but vehicles slow down for. It's really bad drawing of the speed cushion. Anyway, speed cushion on the approach is not a bad one as well. But you need to do something to reduce the severity, reduce the speed, really. And raised pedestrian crossings, which are commonly called wombat crossings, are not only good from that perspective that they reduce the vehicle speed on the approach because they see it's raised, they're going to slow down, it's like a speed hump. It provides that priority for the pedestrians. It also, pedestrians are in a better sight line for drivers. Pedestrians don't have to go down into the road and then back up. It's better for people with challenges in mobility. I use this example as one to show that we actually really have known for a very long time how to achieve high alignment with safe system principles for vulnerable road users. We just never afforded it to the general public. And so this is in Adelaide, and it's an area where there is an island here. So there's a slip lane, there's an island in here, and there was some work being done on the island and the electrics, and there was a couple of workers who are going to be in there for a week doing their work. So at the time, the speed limit on the main road through here was 60 kilometres per hour, and so what they did is they said, well, we've got the workers in there, so we need to reduce the speed of vehicles through the area, and they made it a 25 kilometre per hour work zone, as they do in South Australia. South Australia is the only jurisdiction that does a 25 kilometre per hour work zone. So 25 kilometre per hour, and they put the barriers in place in case a vehicle did still manage to leave their lane and not get to the workers there. So the workers went in there and they did their work, and they came out, and then they removed the barriers, and then they put the speed limit back up to 60 kilometres per hour. And then you have sort of 3,000 pedestrians a day standing here, being exposed to exactly the same forces, exactly the same risk. Well, maybe you could argue that the pedestrian's a little more aware than the worker, because the worker was looking at, whatever they were working on. But mind you, pedestrians are all looking at their phone or whatever they're doing anyway, so they're not really going to be that alert. So we've just basically said there's a hugely different risk profile we're willing to accept if they're a worker or if they're the general public. And in fact, potentially the other way, like the general public has far higher likelihood of being intoxicated or on drugs or half asleep or the like. So they're actually probably at more risk of being involved in these collisions. So we know how to do it. It's just we don't really give that same level of protection to the general public. And if I have to do an elevator pitch on the safe system, elevator pitch being, something you need to convince somebody and tell somebody of something in the time it takes to ride in the elevator, I'll basically say, do you know occupational health and safety, how we think about safety for workers on the road or the like? Yeah, we should afford that level of safety to everybody that uses the road system. And the safe system tries to at least think about things in that mentality. So we've done lots of, there are better things out there, times when you do have pedestrians sitting in the middle of the road, well, protecting them with these sorts of things is good. Raising intersections, slowing vehicles down where there are desire lines and conflict points into tolerable speeds, really good in terms of the likelihood and severity. Now you see there that I'm saying this intersection reduces the likelihood and the severity. The likelihood is predominantly influenced by the signals. The severity is by the raised crossing. It will slow down on the approach. Raised threshold crossing points, again, great facilities. Lowering the speed limit itself has a pretty big effect. I mean, this was just the introduction of the default speed limit, and these are your casualty crashes per year for pedestrians. And you can see there, the year 60 default, 50 default, obviously massive change. Well, pretty big change for just that. I'll pause there, Kathy, see if there's any questions, and then I'll run through motorcyclists.
No questions at the minute. So if anyone does have a question, please just type it in as we go.
Okay, motorcyclists, and I'm on the previous.
Did you pick that one up?
On the previous slide, what was the change? So this change was the year that the default speed limit went from 60 kilometers per hour in urban areas to 50 kilometers per hour in urban areas. That was all. So when I think about motorcyclists, they're generally acknowledged as the hardest road user to fit within the safe system. And that's because of their speed, their vulnerability. They're essentially a pedestrian on something that's going the speed of a car or potentially higher sometimes. So how you manage energy and cater for mistakes with this road user is extremely challenging. Now, I'm a licensed motorcycle rider. I don't actively ride. I do a lot of work in motorcycle safety infrastructure, especially, and it just is hugely challenging for us to do that. But there are some things we know that work. But this is probably an area we need all elements of the safe system working at full throttle, and we need a huge amount of innovation in this space to get us to get much higher alignment with safe system principles. But here are my sort of 5 S's I think about for infrastructure with motorcyclists: site, surface, signs, strike, and speed. If I was in a developing country or a middle income country, I'd probably add in there separation, providing separated motorcycle facilities. Maybe I should be doing that in Australia and New Zealand as well, because we do need different thinking. We need to throw off the shackles of how we've thought about motorcyclists. Motorcyclists fit into what people call the luminary zone, but it's basically, is it night, is it day, but we treat motorcyclists somewhat as a car, but somewhat as a vulnerable road user. In some circumstances, they get both, but neither in a sense. So maybe separation should be added in there. But let me just take you through these briefly. Being able to see a motorcyclist, the surface motorcyclists ride on, and the warning signs and information we provide, all are likelihood influences. The strike is really what happens during the crash. What is the motorcyclist going to hit, or what's going to hit the motorcyclist? That's the severity. And the speed being that magical thing in road safety, influences the likelihood and the severity of crashes. More time for the rider to react, and then when crashes happen, lower severity. When we look at injury curves for motorcyclists, it's quite, we still get a bit of an S curve, but this is very recent research. There you go, 2019 research on motorcycles injuries this was the Swedish analysis, actually by a colleague of mine and a few of his colleagues. And we see there that for different crash types, the characteristic scenarios are presented there in terms of, these are MAIDS 3 and fatal injury crashes. So very high level serious injury and fatality for these different crash types. For head on against a passenger car, well, we see actually the speeds, 25, we're up here. We're getting some higher speeds than we initially predicted. We see more death and serious injury around with barrier systems, and I'll talk about that in a bit, and a few others there. So just some background info for you there. Let's talk about a few of these S's. So sight, being able to see a motorcyclist, they're obviously smaller, they get hidden behind things. Here you can see an intersection and there's a motorcyclist that, it's just hidden behind that tree. It's a fairly small thing, but something to be aware of as you think about likelihood of crashes at intersections or like. Can motorcyclists be seen? Are there things that might block the vision of the motorcyclist? The surface. Surface is far more important for motorcyclists than any other road user. Cyclists, it's up there as well, but motorcyclists, just with the speed that can be travelled, it becomes even more important. We know motorcyclists lean as they go around a curve, and we know there's 2 small contact patches on the surface. We call motorcyclists the canary in the coal mine when it comes to road surface defects. They're the first ones to be killed and seriously injured as a result of them usually, and smaller defects really play out for them. And these influence the likelihood of motorcycle crashes. So that's everything from your potholes to your rutting, flushing, bleeding, all of that sort of stuff. Even also your service lids. So steel plates, service lids, with a bit of moisture on them become very slippery for motorcyclists and cyclists for that matter. Now you might look at that and say, well, it's blindingly obvious, so nobody's going to miss that. Well, if it's at night and a motorcyclist is following behind a truck or a car or something, and they're making this turn, they may see it late, and so it's you've got to think about it from all those perspectives. But that's again a likelihood influencer. Signs. So particular specific motorcycle warning signs are available. They're quite effective in terms of alerting motorcyclists to particular issues and hazards that may be more for them than others. So they're available and they're good. But overall, motorcyclists are very alert to signage, and so we can get likelihood reductions with good, clear signage, consistent signage as well. Strike. So motorcyclists hitting any object are in a high chance of injury or death, any rigid objects. Barrier systems are what we usually put in place to deflect the energy for road users. And for motorcyclists, though, that can be a challenge. We can be adding a strike hazard in there. There's been a lot of research into motorcyclist crashes with barriers. And to boil down sort of 10 years worth of different research, about half the motorcyclists are off their bike, sliding along the ground when they hit a road safety barrier. The other half are still on the bike trying to regain control, and they go over the top of the barrier. They hit the barrier and they go over the top quite quickly. They very rarely run along the barrier, and the ropes, if it's a wire rope system, very rarely have any play in the crash at all. It's the posts that would do the damage. So the idea that wire rope barrier systems are somehow a cheese cutter or the like for motorcyclists is just really not true. It's not backed up with any evidence. The posts are the dangerous part. So here's just a bit of, I hope this streams through for you, but here's the European crash test for motorcycles into barriers. They basically get a 80th percentile male dummy, put it in leathers, tweak around with its neck a little bit and its hands a little bit. But anyway, and then they shoot it at a barrier system at 60 kilometers per hour on a 25-degree angle, I think. They shoot one at the post, one between the posts, and to see what the impact is. The reason they do between the posts is because you'll see shortly they put an underrun protection, and that's what they're really testing. But here's the initial test of the dummy at the post at 60 kilometers per hour. And you can see that pretty much destroys the dummy easily enough to kill the motorcyclist. The forces are big. With an underrun protection, we see it still looks pretty harsh, but the energy is absorbed and deflected, and those are within survivable limits for that 60 kilometer per hour test. Now, if we ran it at 80 or 100, I'm not sure we'd get the same right results, but we've got some decent energy management there as a potential. So it's pretty good system. Speed. We can influence speed in a whole raft of ways, just like other road users. I mean, the advisory speeds, for example, play a pretty good role. And the key is to get that consistency of advisory speeds on those touring routes. So motorcyclists may not follow that speed, but they certainly take it as a very strong indicator of the geometry of the road coming up. So consistency is key. We can use speed limits. We can use so changing speed limits, advisory speeds, and then also utilize the road infrastructure to try to manage speed as well. But it's going to influence both the likelihood and the severity of crashes. Okay, so Kathy, I've left a little bit of time here to take questions or comments from anybody.
Great, Ken, thank you. A question earlier, just before you embarked on the motorcycle bit.
Yeah.
Does reducing speed on a road that is almost at capacity reduce the exposure, as it would mean less vehicles through and vehicles may look at alternative routes?
I think you were getting into some pretty refined exposure measures and also sort of starting to draw a long bow on some of these things. Yeah, you'll see when, I think this will be very much one that you'll get more clarity around once you do a safe system assessment, which we've got to just spend next module giving you the exact, this is what you fill out, this is the table, this is how you get to this, and then out you go and do it. And I think you'll see a bit more there why that doesn't really play out in that way. There are some pretty broad bands in terms of exposure levels for the scoring. So even if you dropped your vehicles by 5% or something like that, it's probably not going to change your band of scoring. So yeah, but I mean, theoretically, maybe you're right, but you'll see in practical reality that the safe system assessment is not that fine-grained a tool, and you're probably not going to see major differences in that. Also, one of the things, and it doesn't really factor into that question, but just sparked me to think, you've got to always think about a road not like through the entire 24 hours of the day. So how does it operate at 3 in the morning, and the like as well, which will be free flow. And so then you're thinking about, there's the congestion's not going to influence speed in that sense, but but that doesn't really relate to your question. Good, thanks, Kathy. That was a good one. Any other questions or comments?
Not at the minute.
Okay. So what we want to do next module, as I said, is to get you ready for your safe system assessment. If you want to jump ahead, you can have a look at the Safe System Assessment Framework, the Austroads document. In fact, I'll just bring up a screen capture of that. Did we have a quiz today, Kathy? I forgot to check.
Sure did, Ken. I've just popped it up there now.
All right, let's do the quiz, and then I'll come back and show that. Remember, you're not being marked on this. This is just one for you to have a go at. What's the question here? True or false? If using a proper helmet and good safety gear, a motorcyclist can be considered as a passenger vehicle or car in safe system crash force tolerances. Whoa. Gee, there's a little bit packed into that question, isn't there? That must have been one of my harebrained 2 a.m. ideas of a question.
When you do your best work, Ken.
Yeah. Good. Lots of people popping in their answers. That's good.
Just give it 10 more seconds and then we'll close that one off. All right, good one.
Okay, mostly saying false. I would say false too, certainly, even with all of that protective gear and the like, a motorcyclist is unable to withstand anywhere near the forces of a passenger vehicle, because the passenger vehicle has the shell, the crumple zones, airbags, seat belts, and all of that stuff. Some motorcyclists are getting better. Motorcycles are getting better with features and airbags and blow-up inflatable jackets, sort of airbag jackets, I suppose. I think they is their name and that sort of stuff. But even still, the forces are nowhere near. And some of you thought it was an unintelligible question, which is probably fair enough. There's probably a bit of a lack of information in there as well. Okay, so I was just going to put the last slide. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about this safe system assessment framework. You can have a flick through it if you want. And this is the guide, the real nuts and bolts of how you do that safe system assessment. It was essential that we went through how, the principles of the safe system, getting some understanding of movement in place and vulnerable road users, spent all that time on analysing energy at intersections, different treatments and the like. You'll see when you get to doing your assessment that this is all stuff that's absolutely required before you get into the actual mechanics of a safe system assessment, which is putting some numbers to the exposure, the likelihood, and the severity. So that's what we're going to be doing next module. For those that are yet to submit your assignment from last module, I'm going to give you the last 5 to 8 minutes of today's session to jump in and start getting onto that, because we want to make sure those are done. You'll get some feedback on those shortly, and that's going to really help you in terms of doing your safe system assessment. So I want you to get that feedback early. Yeah. So Kathy, you've just shared Moodle there.
Yeah, I have. I just wanted to alert people to where those safe system assessment fact sheets are. So we've got the resources folder here, and there's the safe system assessment template in there.
We're not doing the safe system assessment yet.
No, we're not, but just getting you ready for the next session. And those fact sheets that you referred to earlier, a copy of each one of those is in here, which will also be handy for people when they're embarking on their assessment, which you'll go through in the next session.
Yeah. So one more question came in, just a little bit more info wanted on motorcyclists and wire rope safety barrier systems. Yeah, so there's been a huge amount of research done on that from the University of New South Wales to try to understand that. A few factors really come into play. Motorcyclists are, motorcyclists are vulnerable to physical force when striking anything, trees, rocks, rock faces, anything like that. The wire rope safety barrier systems have the exposed posts, which are the danger of motorcyclists. Most of our other barrier systems have that exposed as well. The slight difference is that we don't have any underrun protection products that are effective for wire rope systems, where we do for weak post guard fence systems, so flexible W-beam systems or WBeam systems, G4s or Type Bs or the like, where we can put that underarm protection, which you saw in that video. So the posts are a challenge, but the reality of wire rope systems is that they're very, very extremely rarely struck by motorcyclists at all, because they are used on long straights usually. That's simply because you can't use a wire rope system on a tight radius curve, because it's a barrier system in tension with ropes, and if you have it on a sharp curve and you tension it up, the thing just rips the post out and pops into the middle of the road. So you don't use them on these popular winding motorcycle touring routes. So we use them on the long, fairly straight roads, and motorcyclists are pretty unlikely to leave the road in these situations. It does happen occasionally. In fact, in Victoria here, we had one last night where a motorcyclist hit a wire rope system. Again, though, from what we can see, it's the posts that have been doing the damage. Yeah, so that's the challenge. I know the motorcycle community are very vocal and active about this. When I work with them, I strongly tell them that they are barking up the wrong tree here. There's so many other features that have much higher risk to motorcyclists, and things can be done, and that's what they should be lobbying and advocating for, rather than spending time on the wire rope systems. But if you did have a route that you had higher volume motorcyclists, your choice between going with a wire rope system or a weak post WBeam system with an underarm protection, you'd go the weak post with underarm protection every time, just because of that motorcycle concern, because you've actually actively facilitated that. So hope that sort of clarifies a few little things in there. I know that I found it very interesting in the TMR road safety policy that you have to put underarm protection on all your WBeam systems as a policy position. Certainly, I think there'd be a lot of very, very low risk areas where that mightn't be the best use of your funds, but that was the policy decision. Maybe there's a way that you go through a risk assessment, so maybe that's the default, and then you could risk assess the other way from that. All right, Kathy, unless anything else has popped in.
No, I think that's good. That was a good question, and yeah, glad you got to expand on that a little bit more. So I think on that note, we'll give everyone 4 minutes to finish off that assignment if you didn't get it in, and also to get the quiz done for this session.
Yeah, so don't forget your quiz for this session. Finish off that assignment. And as many of you did, log in a little bit early for our next session for a chance to win a prize. Kathy's prize list is growing.
It sure is.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you Thursday.